must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
That marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug.
Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it and didn't inhale.
One major responsibility is to encourage people to use less drugs.
Entirely legitimate topic for debate.
Radical Rant. Welcome back, everyone. 47 after the hour, and today we're taking a look at a report from the National Commission on State Legislatures, which tells us that there are 12 states out there currently seeking to drug test welfare applicants. That's right. Piss testing for the poor is back with a vengeance in Connecticut, Hawaii, Iowa, Kentucky, Minnesota, Mississippi, Montana, New York, Oregon, South Carolina, Texas, and West Virginia. In fact, West Virginia just advanced their bill in the state Senate on Tuesday. And of course, we've talked about this before in the Radical Rant as to how ridiculous this is. Let me just attack this from a few different angles. Number one, it doesn't really work. The state of Tennessee just recently released the results of its first 6 months of drug testing for welfare. And out of over 16,000 people, only 37 failed a drug test. 37 out of 16,000. And when you consider what the cost is for a drug test, it costs more for these states to implement these procedures than the money they would have saved from not giving out the benefits. And this isn't just Tennessee. This has been found consistently in every state so far that has mandated drug testing for welfare. They find that welfare applicants have a far lower rate of drug test positives than the general public. Now, there's a really good reason for this. Drugs cost money. If you're poor, you don't have the money for drugs. This shibboleth that has been foisted upon us by the reactionary right wing for so long, that there's welfare queens out there and welfare bums that are just using their welfare money to get high, is ridiculous. First of all, the people that are in need of welfare are very often just in temporary need. There are few cases of this intergenerational, lifelong welfare dependency, the kind of welfare queens that the right wing and the conservatives always want to scare you with. For most people, it is a temporary situation. That's why the program's called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It's temporary. And that's the welfare that most people think of welfare. There's also food stamps, that's supplemental nutrition assistance program. And there's unemployment insurance, right? Those are also considered to be a type of welfare safety net. But TANF, the temporary assistance, is the one that most people are thinking of when they talk about welfare. Now, there's no such thing as the welfare check anymore. TANF beneficiaries get a card, like a debit card, and money is put onto that debit card for them. Now, at that point, they can use the card just like they would use cash to take care of bills, expenses, purchases, and so forth. Now, the cry from the legislatures in all these states always goes along the lines of, we shouldn't subsidize someone's drug habit. We shouldn't subsidize, as taxpayers, somebody's abuse of dangerous drugs. But that does not explain to me why none of these legislatures are ever proposing alcohol testing for welfare, or cigarette testing for welfare, or triglyceride checks for welfare. You never hear about this, right? Apparently, as taxpayers, it's perfectly okay for us to subsidize someone's alcoholism if they have alcoholism. It's okay for us to subsidize their smoking habit, and it's okay for us to subsidize their junk food lifestyle. But the marijuana, oh no, oh no, we've got to make sure they're not using the marijuana. And let's not fool ourselves, folks, as to thinking that we're really stopping people from meth or coke or crank or LSD or whatever else. As we all know, those drugs flush out of someone's system relatively quickly. Marijuana stays in someone's system for quite a long time. The drug most often caught in these drug test situations is marijuana. We are talking about eliminating an entire class of people, marijuana consumers, from the social safety net. That's what this is really all about. It's another form of the culture war. For those who hate marijuana, it's another way for them to keep us down, to keep their thumb on us, to make sure that we remain desperate. So there's not a problem with subsidizing drinkers and smokers and fast food, junkies. But there's somehow a problem with the marijuana. And this goes further when we start to talk about how a lot of the states, Colorado now, they're looking at stopping people from using their TANF cards, their EBT cards at dispensaries or pot shops, right? We got to absolutely make sure they don't spend their money on pot, but they can go to the supermarket and buy all the potato chips they want. And for this to be excused by our legislatures as some sort of cost savings, we know that's not true because, like we said, it usually costs more in the cost of reimbursing the failed drug test or the past drug tests than the money that you would save. They found that in Florida. Cost them much more to implement the program than the money they would have saved from it. But we also have to consider just how effective these programs would be anyway, and why are we doing it in the first place? I posit that it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with people worried about the tax money being misspent. It really has more to do with a moral judgment, this idea that the poor are undeserving, and if we give them any sort of social safety net, they become our property, our chattel, our indentured servants, who we may command to do as we please. Now, it's really easy for people in the public to get behind this. The general public doesn't have much understanding of marijuana consumption. They see it as a vice. They may not think people ought to be locked up for it, but they think it's a bad habit and indulgent and self-centered. And they have a problem with people using their welfare money for that. And a large reason for that sentiment, and I see this in comment boards and tweets all the time whenever this subject comes up. Well, I have to take a drug test for my job. You should have to take a drug test for your welfare. And that, to me, is one of the saddest responses to this entire situation. Your oppression is not solved by oppressing someone weaker than you. It seems funny to me that these people will say, well, gosh, I have to take a drug test, so poor people should have to also. They never stop to consider, wait a minute, why am I forced to take a drug test for my job? They just accept that that's the way it is. Rather than pouring all that energy into making sure everyone gets oppressed, how about pouring that energy into reclaiming the freedoms of everyone to not be drug tested, to reclaim our Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizures? How about putting the effort there? And also, you'll get the state legislatures, the politicians who post these bills, oftentimes will say, well, we hear from our business community that they're having trouble finding qualified applicants because nobody can pass the drug test. The idea being, if we drug test for welfare, all those layabout, lazy, unemployed bums on welfare who can't get a job because they keep flunking the piss test, well, they'll stop doing drugs and then they'll be able to get a job because they'll be able to pass the piss test. That's the theory, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you consider the drug test positive rate is far below the public drug test positive rate, right? The people getting welfare are far less likely to fail the drug test than the people who are just applying for jobs. We've seen that year after year. But again, it comes back to this idea of, wait a minute, you're looking at the wrong end of the problem here. You employers that are complaining you can't find enough people to pass the drug test, have you ever considered that maybe the drug test is the problem? Maybe the issue is you're passing up all sorts of wonderfully qualified human beings who would be excellent employees merely because you don't like what they did off hours on the weekend. They chose the wrong relaxant. By God, I sure wish more of my employees or potential employees were drinkers. If only they were all binge drinking on the weekends, I could hire them. But gosh, they smoked a joint last week, so can't hire the guy. Why not think of that and put your efforts there? And I know these employers, they often tell me that, well, we don't want a drug test, but we get this insurance break or we get this. There's always some excuse. There's always some reason. There's always something that affects their bottom line if they don't drug test. So why not put your efforts, employers, into getting bills passed, not to drug test the welfare people, but get a bill passed that changes these drug testing requirements, that changes these insurance requirements or forbids discrimination for these particular situations. It's time for all the people who are complaining about a lack of employable people due to drug testing to start taking a look at the concept of drug testing. That's the problem. Switch this to impairment testing. This was kind of a pipe dream in the 90s when we first started talking about it, but now the technology is quite affordable and easy to use. For baseline electronic impairment testing, you hire someone, they set a baseline on an electronic test, tracks the eye, pupil, hand-eye coordination, that kind of stuff. And then you can test them at any time based on their own baseline, and they will pass or fail that test not based on whether or not they smoked a joint on Friday or got drunk on Saturday, but based on their actual level of impairment. Whether they're impaired from lack of sleep or emotional distress or an illness or a prescription drug or being drunk or being stoned. Nobody wants to work in an unsafe workplace. But this drug testing, this piss testing, isn't making a drug-free workplace, and it's not keeping anyone safer, and it's only serving to discriminate against good people who happen to choose a substance safer than alcohol. That's all the time we got for Hour 1. Thanks, folks. I'm Radical Russ. Until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down.